Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. So be honest, Ian. Before talking to Andrew Jones of Carba, did you think that removing carbon from the atmosphere was a real solution for the atmospheric carbon problem?
So my answer to this question is yes. That being said, it always kind of felt like the ugly stepchild of the climate movement. You know, one of my favorite climate books is called Speed and Scale by John Doerr, and carbon removal is part of that OKR plan, right, to address the climate crisis. But it is also, I feel like, a niche within the industry that has gotten a lot of baggage. And so it's not one that I paid a lot of attention to.
Yeah, okay. I think your take is probably a little more nuanced than mine and probably a little smarter. It's just that the experts that I do subscribe to, a lot of them had taken like kind of a dump on carbon capture and removal, at least in terms of like the value of investing a lot of time and money in it, and they think it's being overinvested in. And so I'd come to thinking that all the money and effort really needed to be devoted to energy transition, agricultural transition, stuff like that. So you can probably see that even in like the guests we've had on this show. It's been totally focused on the emission side. So I think it's good for us to bring Andrew on.
He absolutely schooled us today in terms of how he thinks about carbon removal and how it can be done at scale with impact. One of the things that, you know, has been intriguing to me in terms of following Carba's journey is not just the technical solution that they have, but also the outcome, something known as biochar, which I know from my days in sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture. So that was a little bit unique. But the one thing that I think was my biggest takeaway from this conversation was actually probably the simplest words to come out of Andrew's mouth, which probably says a whole bunch about my understanding in the space. Mm-hmm. But he was like, look, you know, we have put more carbon into the atmosphere by burning coal, oil, other fossil fuels. And so in order to rebalance the scales, we need to pull the carbon back down. It's that simple. And planting trees isn't going to do it. And for me, for whatever reason, that simple framing was like something clicked.
Yeah, he was good at that. And that was a moment for me too. He definitely schooled us today. No question about it. So I hope everybody else listens to this episode and comes away with the same understanding that we did. So without further ado, Andrew Jones of Carba. All right, Andrew Jones, welcome to The Turning Point.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Appreciate it, man.
Great to have you. So I want to start at kind of the global level. Whenever you're in a climate impact conversation, I hear a lot of skepticism about the value of carbon capture. So can we just start there? Why is carbon capture an important part of the decarb puzzle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been working in sustainable chemistry and biofuels for 20 years, and so I've thought about that problem for a long time. The way I like to answer that is, you know, over the last 100 years or so, we've dug up and burned 1 trillion tons of coal and oil, and we put that carbon into the atmosphere. The only way that we can sort of reverse the impact of that is to stop putting more carbon in the atmosphere. That's decarbonization. But then to pull out all that CO2 we put into the atmosphere, because it's going to be up there if we don't do anything about it. And so even if we stopped, let's say today we had, 100% fusion power and we could stop all fossil fuels, and we did that today, you would still have all these legacy emissions in the atmosphere, and we would continue to warm and continue to potentially hit these tipping points where we can't get backwards. Those are what really scare me, these big tipping points where it becomes almost impossible or really difficult to go backwards. And so we have to do carbon removal in order to prevent the worst effects of climate change.
Okay, so I've heard that argument, and then the next thing I hear is, yeah, but the methods of capture that people are proposing are so costly and so low gain in terms of what they can actually pull out of the atmosphere that it's not worth it, and we should be investing our money more on the decarbonization side, to use your terminology.
Yeah, and that's there's some truth and validity to that. There are a lot of solutions out there that are crazy expensive, have, operating expenses, energy costs to them, capex, regulatory hurdles. And that's actually exactly why I got into this. 4 years ago, it was the middle of COVID. I had success with my first company, and I have two young kids at home, and I'm thinking, how do I make sure we don't fuck up the climate for my kids? Sorry if I don't know if I can swear on this podcast.
Curse away, Andrew.
Great. All right, I can be natural then. Um,
Yes.
and I was thinking, how do we make sure for my kids' generation that the planet is livable? And what's the biggest impact I can have? And that's what attracted me to carbon removal. And I was looking at the solutions that were out there, and I thought, we're doing a horrendous job at carbon removal. The technologies I see out there are not scalable, and I need to put my head together with some of the smartest people in the world and figure out if there's a way to do this that is scalable and isn't crazy expensive and doesn't use a ton of energy. Because if you're using energy to fight CO2, it makes no sense. CO2 is an energy problem. The only reason we have CO2 is because we're burning stuff for energy. So you can't fight it with energy, or it's sort of this like perpetual motion machine that doesn't make sense.
I want to double click on that actually, because
Yeah.
I'm following your logic train there, Andrew, of like you've got children, you're thinking about the future, how do we have the biggest impact? And then it sounds like you kind of backed your way into this solution. I'm not asking you to black bag any other carbon removal or any other parts of, the industry, but like how did you end up with this particular solution, or like ending up in this corner of the ring? If you don't, if does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, we wrote a big paper that I'm sure not a lot of your viewers will read, but it's the entropy penalty of carbon removal. Basically, this idea that if you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, it's inherently very energetically difficult, because you're trying to separate CO2, which is 0.04% in the atmosphere, and like purify it and then put it somewhere. So that takes a lot of energy to do that, just fundamentally. And so we wrote a paper about why trying to do that is very expensive, and why we kind of need to leverage nature to do that heavy lifting, because nature already does this for free. They do it with plants and trees, where photosynthesis pulls in CO2 and uses solar energy to upgrade the CO2 into the structure of plants, like lignin and cellulose. The only problem is those plants die, and then when they die, they re-release all that carbon back into the atmosphere, and that's the so-called fast carbon cycle. Our realization was because we've dug up a bunch of old trees and burned them, we can actually now do what happened 300 million years ago during the Carboniferous period, and we can actually prevent those trees from decomposing, and basically bury them back underground, like what created all the coal in the first place. Yeah. So
Okay.
I don't know if I answered your question. I went on a long story there, but yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Okay. I want you to talk more about the process that you do with the biochar, but really quick, what is the Carboniferous period for those of us who are not geologists?
Yeah, so I love to reference this because it's a great analogy to what we're doing. 300 million years ago, there was a 60 million year period called the Carboniferous period, where nearly all of our coal was created. And so the theory, there's still some debate, but the theory is that all of these ferns, because there weren't trees yet, started to grow into trees. They discovered how to make lignin, which is sort of that bark outside structure. And that lignin protected them from microbial attack and allowed them to grow tall. And so they grew into these tall fern-like, tree-like structures. And then they died and they fell over. And for whatever reason, they started to get buried and turned into all the coal deposits, essentially all the coal deposits we know today. Now, oil was created in a different process with plankton and algae in the oceans and sinking and things like that. But all the coal, which came from these tree-like structures, happened during this 60 million year period called the Carboniferous period. And so it's kind of wild to think about all that happened. It sequestered all this carbon, and then it stopped at, after 60 million years, it stopped because there's two theories. One is that these microbes, these fungi, actually figured out how to break down lignin at that time. And so these trees, once they died, they started to decompose and they weren't protected anymore. And then the second theory is that there was more sort of subduction activity, more burial activity that buried these structures and kept them permanent. And it was probably a blend of both, but yeah.
Wow, the things we learn on this podcast, man.
And so that's what Carba's doing. We're essentially recreating the Carboniferous period, but we don't have 60 million years to solve climate change. We have more like 100 or even less. And so we need to spend money on decarbonization, and we should spend the bulk of money on decarbonization. But today we spend about 99% of the dollars on decarbonization, and that's switching, off of fossil fuels with things like solar and wind and nuclear and geothermal. We only spend like 1% to 2% on carbon removal. That number needs to go up because that needs to be a sizable fraction of what we're doing to prevent the worst effects of climate change.
Okay, so you've explained to us how it makes more sense to let the plants themselves do the job of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. What is the next step then? So what is Carba doing, and why is wood waste a really good pathway for helping to sequester that carbon and keep it from going back into the atmosphere?
Yeah, so what we realize is you can't just plant enough trees to solve this problem. You can't get enough sequestration, and at some point when the earth warms enough, some of these forests become net emitters. So like the Amazon this year just became a net emitter of carbon, which is terrifying.
Wait. Can we stop on that? I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
A forest can become a net emitter?
Uh-huh. Yeah, because of decay and warming and other issues.
Is it because people are chopping down the trees in the Amazon? Is that why they're...
Not even that. I mean, that is bad, but no, forests... There's competing effects. So forests have albedo effects where they absorb a lot of the heat and don't reflect it back. And then you also have decomposition effects where, in the forest floor, you can decompose into CO2 and methane, a lot of the organic matter. So not all forests are created equally, and the climate can affect whether forests are net absorbing or net emitting. And I'm not an expert in that field, but essentially the big thing is we need to be planting as much trees as we can. We need to be protecting as many forests as we can, but it's not going to be the complete solution. And so what we realize is that there's actually a lot of waste organic material, whether it's forest thinnings for wildfire management or, when someone comes to your house and cuts down a dead tree, those things add up. And then there's agricultural waste streams. There's cattle waste streams, there are algae and sargassum and things like that there's a lot of organic waste streams, and those naturally decay and re-release all the CO2 and methane. If we could protect those waste streams and prevent that decomposition, then we could effectively remove that carbon from the fast carbon cycle, and it would sequester it and do the job of carbon removal. And so then the question is, how do you protect that material in the best possible way? And there's two parts to that. One is the location. So you don't want to truck this stuff around the world. Biomass is decentralized, meaning, all the trees in the world don't grow in one place. They grow across the planet. And so because of that, and because you don't want to truck this stuff, you need to operate in a decentralized way where to keep costs down, and so you're not trucking water, basically, biomass being 60% plus water. So that's the first part, is location. And then the second part is, how do you actually prevent microbes from eating this stuff and basically crapping out CO2 and methane, because they've been evolved over time to actually do that very, very well. And so if you just bury wood, it's going to produce a bunch of methane. If you compost it, you're going to produce mostly CO2 with a little bit of methane. And then if you burn it, you're going to produce mostly CO2, some particulate matter, and some methane. Um, so you want to prevent those from happening. And the way that we've discovered how to do that, and people have known this for a long time, is if you heat this biomass, you can create a black charcoal like material, and that no longer has food value for microbes underground. And so we can take that, what's called a biochar or a charcoal or a biocarbon, they're all synonymous, and you can take that and you can put it underground or places where you're blocking it from oxygen and sunlight, and nothing can decompose that.
I do want to pause for a moment and
And I'm going deep, so I can go like less deep.
no, this is good. I mean, because we're nerds, and admittedly, this is part of the reason why we like having these conversations. But
Yeah.
I think it is important if we can just kind of summarize here. And Andrew, you'll be able to do a better job than I.
Yeah.
We started the conversation with you saying, "Hey, look, this is the solution that we ended up at. Like we've emitted all this CO2, and in order to balance the scales, we need to pull it back."
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm a little ashamed that I hadn't thought about it in that simplistic of terms, because I think there's a lot of complexity, obviously, with climate change, and there's also a lot of complexity in the narrative around climate change.
For sure. Yep.
And then as we move forward, you were essentially, we started talking about, forests and the carbon capture ability of plants and trees. And there's all sorts of complexity within like the carbon credit market, which I don't want to divert the conversation, but I'm sure, for anyone who's at least mildly tuned into this conversation, they might be aware of some of the challenges or constraints with carbon credits, and the concept of additionality, and if you don't cut down the forest, is that actually sequestering carbon or not, yada yada yada. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But I think to then kind of chunk down one more layer of, this is just how the science works, and if we can get biomass into this state and then keep it from being decomposed further, we can effectively kind of back our way into this. And I think it's just like, yeah, we've gone deep, and we appreciate that from you, but I also think it's a rather simple way of thinking about it, which I appreciate, because I think there's a lot of rabbit holes to go down in this conversation, and there's naturally a lot of emotions, which sometimes overrides logic, and so you just have a very logical way of thinking about it, which I appreciate.
Yeah. And I think I've learned to sort of cut the conversations off to make it simple, because I think people do overcomplicate it for a variety of reasons. But in the end, it's a simple carbon balance. Like, we dug up a bunch, it's in the atmosphere, now we got to bring it back. Trees are already bringing it back. How do you kind of use that to your advantage, and protect that?
Yeah. So you have explained it pretty logically. So I guess one of the questions I have is, if that's so logical, why hasn't been done the way you're doing it before? Or why has it not been done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets to business models and markets and questions that, and regulatory type things. I mean, I think maybe what you're getting at is that there are a plethora of solutions to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And, I do ascribe a bit to the sort of all and above theory, which is we need to be doing and trying a lot of things. I think what's garnered a lot of attention is direct air capture, for many reasons. I was at Berkeley when they were doing a lot of the MOF studies on carbon removal, and that Omar Yagi just won the Nobel Prize for that sort of work. Direct air capture has been sexy, for lack of a better word, for academics, because we can study these models and we can get better absorbance. It's also been sexy in the media because they're like these big vacuum machines. And unfortunately, what that's meant is a ton of money, both publicly and otherwise, has gone toward direct air capture, which it is, it can be part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. And as I mentioned, it's super expensive. It's high CapEx. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles to doing it. And then like being near a CO2 injection well, or piping that injection, that CO2 around the country, there's a lot of NIMBYism there. And then furthermore, because of the energy requirements, you need it to situate near big solar fields, and that makes it really difficult to sort of get these things off the ground. What we're doing is very different. It's very, I would say, unsexy, and it's decentralized. So it's these smaller plants, which like is harder to get investment in a lot of ways. It's easier in some ways, but harder because it's not that big sexy plant that you can do a ribbon cutting and get politicians on. And so I think for a variety of reasons, biochar and biochar-like and biomass-related projects haven't seen as much investment and notoriety in the press. That being said, like 80% of the deliveries in durable carbon removal have been biochar. So it is one of these solutions that's actually delivering credits and at a price point that most people can stomach. And so what we've done is taken those ideas and leveled it up to sort of more permanence by putting it underground, and then these co-benefits of burying it in places like landfills where we can use it as a filter to remove PFAS and reduce methane emissions at the landfill as well. So did that answer your question?
Yes, definitely answered the question. And actually that leads me right where I want to go next, which is let's actually get into the details a little bit. Yeah. How do the machines that you guys make turn wood into biochar? Like what's that process like? And then talk to us about the end product, that biochar, and those co-benefits. And then if you can along the way, talk to us about, why is the cost reasonable? Why is it not as energy consumptive as, other carbon sink options? Like talk about those benefits too.
Okay. Yeah. A lot in there.
That was the best compound question I have ever heard you ask.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You might need to remind me when I forget.
Yeah.
It's going in the compound question Hall of Fame.
Yeah. But to start, I think the first question is, so how do these machines work? How do you convert biomass into biochar? And actually making biochar is incredibly easy. Any one of you, my kids have done this. Any one of you can do this in your backyard. And we have been as a civilization doing it for thousands of years. Essentially, if you just suffocate a fire, the heat from that will create charcoal. And anytime you've had a fire, you've had leftover chunks of charcoal. That is biochar. So biochar is just the product of heating wood in the absence of oxygen. And by doing that, it reacts in a process called pyrolysis, pyro meaning heat, lysis meaning breaking bonds. And so you're just heating it and breaking bonds in a way that gets it closer to graphite as a material. That's the thermodynamic endpoint. And so you create these, from a chemical perspective, these highly aromatic carbon structures, if anyone's taken chemistry before. But essentially they're very recalcitrant and aren't eaten as easily by microbes as things like cellulose, which is readily eaten and turns into simple sugars. So our machines, what you would do in your backyard is create a fire, cover it with dirt, light it, and then suffocate it and over 24 hours. And they still do this in places like Africa and India. The trick is then not making biochar, it's doing it at an industrial scale with high yield and being able to run these things 24/7 and being able to be very energy efficient and not produce a lot of pollutants when you do it. Because if you were to do that in your backyard, you're going to create a lot of particulate matter and other toxins. So we've developed basically an oven, kind of like a Traeger grill, where wood comes in, it gets heated without oxygen, and then out the back end, you get this biochar product. And because we're able to control heat and process time and temperatures, we can produce a very high quality product with high yield and do it very, very efficiently. We use a technology called molten salts, which are just like liquefied salts that hold temperature really well, and we can pump heat all around the system, and that's really unique for us, and it gives us a really good advantage in terms of yield and efficiency.
Cool. Okay, so that's part one.
That's part one.
Yeah, so part two, tell us about, now you have this biochar, you've produced it at high yield and efficiency. What do we do with the biochar?
Yeah, so there's a lot of options. So now you've got a charcoal, which has a lot of porosity, and you can do a lot of different things with that. The first thing that people did was apply it into fields, right? So it sort of mimics what happens after a forest fire, which, as we know, like creates really nice fertile soils. And the reason for that, it holds water better, it holds microbes better. The only problem with that is that it's above ground, and so now it's harder to do measurement and verification to prove that it stays there. And it also is liable to be broken down. So there's microbes, there's sunlight, there's ozone, there's all these things that haven't been studied super well and can break down the biochar over time. So you can sell it more as like a nature-based credit. The other options, you can put it into materials like concrete as a filler. You can, potentially upgrade it into things like graphite for electrodes. You can also burn it instead of coal. And people have been doing this for a long time, this charcoal. You can burn it and use it to make steel or use it to make, to run blast furnaces and things like that. What we've chosen to start with is actually to bury it. And the reason we've done that is by burying it, we can protect it from oxygen and protect it from sunlight. And we can put it in a fixed place where we can check it and say, yeah, it's here 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years later. This carbon that we can physically hold, which came from CO2 in the atmosphere, we can put it underground and we can confirm that it's there. The other reason we bury is we don't just dig a hole. We look for holes that exist, and the most polluting holes that exist are landfills. And because this material is porous, it acts like a filter. And so we can put it into landfills as a daily cover, and it acts like a filter in the landfill. And one thing to realize that I didn't realize when I started this is in landfills, every day they have to cover a landfill with 6 inches of soil. It's called a daily cover. And so they put a bunch of waste down, they compress it, and then they put 6 inches of soil. And then the next day they put waste and then soil. So we can mix in with that soil, this biochar, and it acts like a percolation filter, like a Brita filter, if you will. And it will pull in toxins like PFAS and other things out of the landfill so it doesn't get into our drinking water. The other benefit is on top, every day, you have this active biochar layer, which can eat and oxidize methane. So if there's fugitive methane emissions coming up, you have these microbes called methanotropes that eat methane and produce CO2. And so that's it's much better for the environment to get rid of the methane. And so we have these like co-benefits as well as permanent burial. And then of course you can reduce odor, which is the whole reason they require these daily covers, is to reduce odor for the communities and reduce waste from flying off and reduce the animals from getting the waste. Because if you've ever been to a landfill in Minnesota, there's like hundreds of eagles flying around because they're huge scavengers. So short history on landfills, but that's how we chose to do burial, and then why we chose landfills as the best possible place to bury because of all these co-benefits. And we're plugging into an industrial framework that is already moving megatons of material. Why not add carbon to that and sequester this carbon?
That's so cool. So add daily cover to the things I learned on the podcast today after the
landfill management. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing.
The other thing was carboniferous.
Carboniferous period. Right. That's our other word of the day. So can we talk a little bit about how this works as a business model?
Yeah.
So do you sell to the landfill operators?
So in terms of business model today, we are getting revenue streams from biomass. So people, if you're willing to be decentralized, there is enough waste biomass where people will generally pay you to take it or let you take it for free. And so we are able to get a revenue stream from the biomass. We are also then able to take a revenue stream from the carbon credits that we sell. So for every ton of CO2 that we bury, we're able to sell that as a credit to one of the buyers. But that gets into the risk standpoint. there's an interesting concept of additionality that these projects, no one's going to buy these credits unless it's financially additional, meaning they have to, the project wouldn't stand on its own without carbon credits. But at the same time, the carbon credit market is a voluntary market in the US, and so it's inherently risky because no one's forcing these people to buy, and there's only, about 100 major buyers of carbon credits. And so, that brings in sort of the venture level risk of how fast is this market going to grow? I don't think it's a question of, is this going to be a market long term? I think it's how fast will it grow? And, there's a McKinsey report where they predict it'll be 30 billion by 2030 and a trillion by 2050. That's what we need to get to save the planet. I don't know if it necessarily means that's what it's going to get to, and we don't know how fast it will grow into that.
So on the carbon market concept, we've had guests on the show. We've been talking about carbon markets. Is it because, how common is biochar in the carbon market? And then how difficult is it for you to price for those potential customers?
Yeah. So the carbon credit market in general, or even carbon offsets, is massive. Many of those purchases were nature-based solutions. So if you look at the spectrum of carbon removal, you have in carbon offsets, you have on the really cheap end, sort of $5 to $50 a ton of CO2e, you have nature-based projects where they're either preventing deforestation, which those are the projects that have gotten a lot of, press for being a lot of BS. So there's a big Guardian article that said 93% of all of those credits sold were bullshit. And that's because the forests weren't at risk, or there was corruption, or, sometimes you plant a forest and it burns down, or it doesn't take, it's actually harder to do well, or it's a monoculture and there's no diversity. And so you're just creating this sort of sterile environment that doesn't do exactly what you'd want. And you could create forests that are net emitters and things like that. So there's that side of the equation. You've seen, because of this bad press, you've seen the market moving towards more durable removals. And that's where you get into afforestation, reforestation, where they're actually planting new trees where there were or were not trees before. You get into then engineered or technical removals, things like what we're doing, or direct air capture, or enhanced rock weathering, where you can more readily measure the exact amount of CO2 and lock it up. And so those have price tags, anywhere from $100 to $200 for biochar, to $300+ for ERW, enhanced rock weathering, to $700 for direct air capture and oil injection, and then there's other ones in between. And so you've got this huge spectrum of quality and price. And then you have a huge spectrum of buyers that are looking at different things and different reasons and co-benefits that they want to see as well. So the market is difficult to understand and very dynamic.
Yeah, that was kind of my question. So you guys have what seems like high quality, durable, co-benefit bearing solution. So does that mean that you, roughly speaking, command a higher price within the market?
Yeah, our theory is we're sort of direct air capture like permanence, so geologic like permanence at the price point of biochar. So we can usually, charge a bit more than biochar because we're burying it and locking it up better. And we have some of these co-benefits that help sort of sweeten the deal. They're not valorized today, but they sweeten the deal. And because you're selling against a portfolio, and a lot of these companies, rightfully so, are buying portfolios of credits where it includes maybe 10% DAC and 20% biomass and those types of things. But I think nobody can predict what the next 5 years are going to look like. There's a lot of companies that have made net zero commitments, near or after 2030, and carbon removal is going to have to be a part of a lot of those solutions. right now people are still figuring out how do we do this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a question here, and Justin will do what he normally does, which is like grab the string on the balloon and pull us back down to earth. But Andrew, you clearly know this. Like, you live in this space, you work in this space every day. And one of the things that I found interesting and a bit challenging, and I don't necessarily come to a place of resolution with, is oftentimes I feel like the best solution for the environment is one that is, holistic, circular, integrative, right? There's all these co-benefits, and it can be kind of hard to draw a direct line, from A to B. Whereas I feel like the markets that we've built, for better or worse, are really, they want to be a one-to-one correlation. And I'm not necessarily asking you to speculate on where you think the market is going, but I guess the question here is, with the nature of the makeup of where the market is, to your last point about, these companies who've made these commitments to be carbon neutral by 2030, they don't know how they're going to do it yet. That's only 5 years away. Like, what are your thoughts about just the structure of the market and the relationship between really trying to put this stuff into dollars and cents and decimals on paper versus the nature-based solutions, which are always more holistic and integrative in nature? No pun intended.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really well thought question in terms of like, is the market going to drive us to the right place? Like, is it an efficient market? I think the answer is no. Capitalism is not driven to do the best thing for the environment because we're not pricing in all the externalities. So I think, efficient markets don't really work here. I do think if we had a price on carbon, it would help immensely because I think capitalism would help drive a lot of good things. Now, there'd be unintended consequences that I can't predict, but and I'm a strong believer of efficient capitalistic markets. But I think when it comes to the environment, we've seen that that doesn't necessarily work. So I think what we're seeing today is a small subset of tech buyers are deciding what the best thing is, and voting with their dollars because they have the most dollars to do that. And I think that they are very intelligent with what they're doing, and they have very good people making these decisions. And some of them have pretty big teams kind of putting this together. That being said, like, it's going to be what they decide that survives. And so I think what we really need in this market, and they would agree, is some standardization, some government involvement. Ultimately, carbon removal is a public good. Like, the only reason we're doing this is to reduce human suffering in the future. In a way, that should be taxpayers, that should be public. In the same way we pay to remove our trash, we should pay to remove our CO2 trash, which is just invisible, so we haven't had to pay for it. And so I don't know how the market solves this. That's sort of above my pay grade, but I strongly believe that we need a price on carbon, and because it's a public good, sort of the public should come together on this somehow. And I think the tech companies are doing great work, and without them, it would be a non-existent market. So I'm like eternally grateful for what they're doing. But they're driving it, to your question, like, where's the market going to go? It's going to be based on the buyers, right? Because my company won't survive unless we get purchasers, because our model is reliant on that. And every carbon removal company is reliant on that because of financial additionality.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the thoughtful reply, because it's something that I think is hard to rectify, and it's okay because at least we're doing something. Are we doing enough? Probably not. I think the science would say definitely not. But your comments earlier about like the nature of your business model being decentralized, I think it's one that would be easy to overlook. But in reality, if we're going to right the ship, we need a bunch of micro solutions across the board, literally and figuratively, and I think it's really easy to get into this space and then paint or think with a broad brush, and again, try and draw a straight line from A to B, when really that's just not how we're going to solve the problem. So Anyway, appreciate the thoughtful reply, and it'll be interesting to see where the market does go.
I'm glad you brought that up. I want to touch on that briefly, and you may not include this in the podcast, but it's that decentralized point is super key, and you're right, it's glossed over, because the MO for someone, a capitalist, an entrepreneur, and this has happened time and time again. If I want to make money, I want to build a biofuels plant that uses biomass, or I want to burn biomass to make energy. I will necessarily make that as big as I possibly can for economies of scale. But that is the worst thing to do for the environment with biomass, because if you create a 1,000,000 ton per year biomass plant, you can't grow 1,000,000 tons of biomass in a 20-mile radius. So that means you're now telling the market, okay, I need biomass, I need a ton of biomass in this facility. Go cut it down and ship it to me, and I'll pay you $100 a ton. Which means now you're incenting bad actors to cut down trees and do unsustainable deforestation. You are trucking water, so you're trading diesel for water because biomass is 60% water. And you've got this logistical challenge of like centralization. But that's what, if you're making a biofuel or you're making electricity, that's what you have to do, because now you're plugging into systems. And I think that's really bad. So I'm actually, against a lot of these biomass to electricity and biomass to fuels plants, because I think they incent a lot of bad behavior, and we've tried them time and time again in the past. And frankly, burning biomass for energy is not clean. And we've tried to do clean coal in the past. The incentives are not necessarily there to clean up the emission streams, and it's failed to get off the ground. So that's kind of my opinion, of course, that I think, you can't do biomass scale projects, with a few exceptions where it's already being aggregated. It incents the wrong behaviors. And so this decentralization is super important. And I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of walking the plank with your business, right? Because it's not, like you said, sometimes it's a more investable model, and in many ways it's not, because of just the nature and the structure of it. But I just think it's important. Like, I wanted to double click on this, one for myself, but two for the listeners, that so often these solutions come back to being place-based. Like we see it in agriculture, we're seeing it here, and it's just another drop in the bucket, right? And it might be a cliche at this point, but it's like the solutions are going to happen on a local level, and we need to understand the importance of it and the complexity of how we're going to solve these problems at a local level, because that's how it rolls up into the big burrito at the top.
Exactly. And most companies are not equipped to do that, right? Like big oil and gas, they do big centralized projects. It's a new model, and there's complexity in that, but I think AI can help with that complexity. I think, it's a new business model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and, I'm obviously not speaking from experience here, but, the last few years of the investment space, has been largely tech, and like, you're not building a SaaS business, you're not selling a software as a service. You're trying to solve a really complex problem in a really unique way. And like, the investment models just need to adapt accordingly.
Finance is a whole nother topic we can get into.
Yeah.
Yeah, this conversation is really bringing me back to some of the other founders we've spoken to in other spaces. And we hear similar challenges, right? When it comes to the actual needs of the environment and the biosphere, those timescales, those geographies do not necessarily align with the efficiencies of capitalism and the timescales of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And so then you're sitting in the middle. You understand what the biosphere needs, but you've got investors over here, right? You've got customers over here, and you've got to sit in the middle and basically be a translator in between, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are your biggest translation challenges as the founder in this seat?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the finance structure, right? And I thought long and hard about whether I make this a nonprofit or whether it should be a for-profit, and that was a conscious choice. And I strongly believe for-profit is the best for scaling, and for the planet. And I think if you make it a nonprofit, you do like project by project, and it doesn't hit that liftoff velocity as easily. I think there's a translation challenge because you have venture capital over here that wants incredibly high growth, SaaS-like models that I would argue are incompatible with hard tech in a lot of ways, and especially incompatible with clean tech. Even though you have firms that have a so-called double bottom line, it's hard to rectify. And then over here you've got, the philanthropy and sort of grant money, sort of smaller checks. And we did win a $7 million Department of Energy grant, currently paused.
I was just going to say, did you ever get that?
Nope. And so you've got like sort of the grant tiny bucket where you can do a little bit. You've got some philanthropy, which we've been able to unlock some of that through debt vehicles. And then you've got these huge, project finance companies that will do infrastructure financing, at the sort of $100 million scale. And then ventures sort of this in between. And so there's a gap for first of a kind financing where if you're unlucky, you can get venture capital to do, an equity round and fund your first of a kind with equity capital, which is the most expensive capital. But for a lot of people, there's then a gap to sort of your second, third of a kind because infrastructure capital is not there yet. And so my struggle with translation has been to talk to venture capital and make them understand why this can scale and, why the carbon removal market is not as risky as they might think, but also why, we're CapEx light and why we can scale this with creative solutions, not necessarily equity financing. And then I've also we've worked with some really great philanthropic partners who've put debt into a PRI structure and allowed us to do first of a kind financing with debt, which is a huge unlock. And most people don't have access to that. So we've been very lucky, but it's being creative. And to your point of translating what do we need and what's out there and trying to align it with the mission of those types of companies and funding sources.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, are you finding funding sources who understand the difference and are getting more sophisticated to think about, we're willing to invest in this. We understand the environmental payoff and that it might be operating a little differently than a SaaS company?
Yes and no. There's a lot of work. A lot of really smart people are trying to break down that barrier of the gap and try to figure out how to project finance more first of a kinds and using creative capital, things like philanthropy, donor advised funds. And that's available. A lot of it is education though. Like most philanthropies want to give their money away. They don't necessarily want to do a loan, even though they get that money back and it becomes very catalytic. So there's sort of education pieces to that. But then the no part is, at the end of the day, people still need to make money and they still need to compare this to other asset classes. And so, environment is an important aspect of an investment, but it needs to stand on its own, right? And make money there. We've been able to use that environment to help us help them stomach the higher credit risk that a startup would have. But the business fundamentals absolutely need to be there.
Mm-hmm. Just out of curiosity, can I ask what a machine costs to build?
Yeah. I will say I don't know if we've publicly disclosed that yet.
And so you don't have to.
In our paper, we have a paper out in ACS Engineering that gives some figures on CapEx, and we're not far off from what that says. So
okay, we'll do the podcast host will do research on that and plaster it all over on the video. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Just on the bottom, just a rolling. Yeah, I like that.
For the entire hour.
Yeah. It's less. A single site is going to be less than 10 million. So we're not looking at, direct air capture like investments of hundreds of millions, which really helps because there's a very small slice of the pie of people that will do hundreds of millions of dollars of investment or even $1 billion, right? That's sort of the realm of oil and gas and big infrastructure projects.
You spoke a lot about the co-benefits of landfill, and why you chose to target there first. But I think it's just another thing to say, or to emphasize for listeners, is that my understanding, and I'm sure yours is more sophisticated, is that biochar also has a wonderful capacity to improve soil fertility, and the soil's ability to store carbon, or at least sink carbon. And I think we should just keep in mind the fact that, like, soil is the number one land-based carbon sink. And so by improving soil fertility, with additives like biochar, it's not just it's not just a one-to-one correlation. There's these other co-benefits that are going to be hard to track, but will ultimately help us kind of reach that exponential growth that we need to in order to solve these problems. So that wasn't much of a question, and you probably had some interesting, like, one of the things that I was eager to know, and I think you kind of answered it, which is, have you explored the idea of, we're obviously in a rich agricultural part of the country, and theoretically some of your outputs could, help with sustainable agriculture, but perhaps it's a conversation for another day.
No, I'm happy to elaborate a little bit. So actually, when we started Carba, the first thing we did was align with a USDA soil expert. And, we were attracted to this idea of circularity, that we could create biochar and then improve soils, especially here in the Midwest. And I don't know if you've heard this statistic, but it's something like over the last 50 years, we've lost 7 feet of topsoil due to erosion. And I've talked to some farming friends. They're like, I don't know how exactly true that is, but there's been a lot of erosion. And you think of like Dust Bowl and things like that, where you just get losses. And a lot of that's because we're not cover cropping. We're not doing, a lot of regenerative ag. We're just tilling and stripping and things like that. And so there's a huge need to improve farming practices, and that can have a massive impact on carbon and the environment. And so I'm all for all of that. And that was the first thing I did with Carba, was I went out to farmers and said, hey, I can make this stuff which will improve water retention. It will improve, nitrate fixing bacteria. It'll help reduce compaction, bring more carbon into the soils. Like, all those things are absolutely true and can improve yields when done in the right way, depending on the pH of the soil. And so there's tons of research across the world in these types of applications. And the reality is a little bit more complex. Like, you need to know what soil you're adding it to, what the pH is, how you add it, what you do, how you incorporate it with cover cropping and regen ag practices and things like that. And so I think absolutely we should be doing those things. What the struggle we found from a business model perspective is, when I went to the farmers and said, hey, well, is this something you're interested in? They said no. And so farmers are just a really tough market to sell into, especially now. They don't have a lot of money. They don't want to take a lot of risks. And certainly there's going to be like more forward-looking ones that are using biochar and starting to build this up. And I'm all for that, and we'll support that as much as we can. But from building like a gigaton scale removal company, it didn't seem like the beachhead to start with. And so we have a microbial mycologist on staff who, works with these things and helps us figure out blends and things like that. And so we can do some of that. But the market size right now is very artisanal, very sort of bagged, 25-pound bag, char and things like that. But I am very much in favor of the soil benefits. And actually, I'm more in favor of, let's get regenerative ag practices everywhere, because that's the single greatest thing that's going to start rebuilding the carbon in our soils. And then biochar can be kind of an infusion to get us back up to the levels. But I actually believe that once you have a regenerative ag practice, you don't need to add more soil, because you're getting that from the organics.
Yeah, I was particularly thinking, we had a guest on several episodes ago, Nick Renke, and in the regenerative ag space. And one of the things that we spent time talking about was the risk that farmers incur switching from conventional to regenerative practices. And there's this multi-year gap where they're in transition. And to your point, A, not a good market for customers, but B, it's not a market that can incur a lot of risk, capital risk, because most of them are already buried in debt. So anyway, that was just one thing that I was thinking about and curious about, in terms of, again, some of these co-benefits. But again, we could save it for another day.
Yeah.
Yeah, always a tough beat when the customers just aren't interested.
Yeah, right. Maybe there's something not here. I learned that in my first company. If you have something the customers don't want, it's probably not worth going down that road.
Yeah. That's a tough way to start a business. So Andrew, we have a few questions that we ask all of our guests at the very end, and we like to give everyone an opportunity to speak directly to the audience about their movement and their mission. So you've probably already answered this first question, but it's what is the highest leverage systems change that would help move the carbon sequestration movement as a whole forward?
I mean, I think I said it, but if we could put a price on carbon, actually price the externality, we'd be gold. We could solve this.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's what I was thinking. And then on the other side, what is one individual level thing that citizens or consumers like us could do to support that carbon removal mission?
I think the single greatest thing people can do in the collective us is to continue to make decisions with our wallets. And that means like supporting brands that have sustainability and are actually doing something and holding them accountable to those things. Because that does have a real impact where it, with the SEC rules now, these companies that have said they're going to make, that have a net zero pledge, they have to do that and they have to show because it's baked into their stock price now. And so as long as we as customers are sort of demanding that and voting with our wallets, we can and will get there. The second thing with that is like if there's ways to, when you're making purchases, to sort of tack on and add a little bit for carbon. I don't know if there's any ones that I can point to that do that really well yet. But it goes back to voting with your dollars and showing companies that this is important to you.
You heard it here, everybody. Keep voting with your dollars. And then last question. So we are organizational development dorks, and we work with a lot of mission-driven founders who are balancing the kind of challenges that you're balancing. So we always like to ask if you have any advice for those other founders or organizations.
Ooh, specifically to mission-driven founders?
Absolutely, yes.
And also to budding entrepreneurs that are looking. I love mission-driven companies because you're able to recruit better. Your mission is crystallized, and immovable. And so I think those are reasons to get into this. For those that are doing it, I think we're in a tough time for doing good in the U.S.
One could
It's
say
almost
that.
like we're getting attacked for doing good in a lot of ways. But I think the overwhelming majority of us, care about the environment, care about human suffering and reducing human suffering. And so everyone is supportive of that and, keep on doing that work. Even if the dialogue, at a macro level isn't supporting it. People are doing this even behind the scenes. Like we hear about these shadow buys of carbon removal. It will continue because most people care. And we're all with you.
All right. So even if people are quietly resisting, trust that it's happening. Trust that it's in the air.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Resist. So I have to say, I had a sticker from the American Civil Liberties Union on my window at home, and it said "Dissent is patriotic." This was like 10 years ago or something, and I had a child who was like 3 years old, and he tore half of it off the window, and I'm like, I can't be upset about that. I don't know if he knew what he was doing.
Oh no, he's thinking next
Yeah.
level.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think
Either
it's
irony or
worth.
synchronicity.
Yeah.
I've been a supporter of asking questions, and if that's dissent, that's dissent. But we need to continually push push against the status quo no matter what's happening and ask ourselves if there's a better way to do it.
That's what we do here at the Turning Point, hopefully.
Yeah.
Andrew Jones, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a joy.
Thank you guys. It's been my pleasure. And appreciate you guys doing this in your infinite free time.
Infinite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same for you. Appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Thank you guys.
Big thanks to Andrew Jones of Carba for coming on the show today. You can learn more about their carbon removal technology at carba.com. That's CARBA.com. And if you're a mission-driven leader or founder looking to grow your impact, you can check us out at stillpointinsight.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.